Thank you for being here with us tonight. Good evening. My name is Sarah Pate, and I would like to welcome you on behalf of the Washington Center for the Book, an affiliate of the Library of Congress Center for the Book, and a partnership between the Washington State Library and the Seattle Public Library. The Washington Center for the Book promotes literacy and a love of books, reading, and libraries. We celebrate Washington's robust literary heritage and shine a spotlight on the contributions of reading and libraries in strengthening communities and in fostering civic engagement. One of our projects is the Washington State Book Awards, and we are thrilled to have you here tonight for another event in our series to celebrate the 2021 Washington State Book Award winners. Our next event will be February 2nd at 6 p.m. with Jennifer Haupt, editor of Alone Together, Love, Grief, and Comfort in the Time of COVID-19. And I'll put the link to that event and our other confirmed events and recordings in the series into the chat after this intro. We'd also like to say a huge thanks to our event partner for tonight and for this entire series, the Washington Library Association. I'd like to welcome Brianna Hoffman, WLA Executive Director, to say a few words about WLA.
Thank you, Sarah. Since 1931, the Washington Library Association has been a leader in the Washington library community, providing advocacy, professional development, and leadership opportunities to our members, while also promoting intellectual freedom and innovation. We are so excited and honored to be partnering with our friends, the Washington Center for the Book, for this series of events. On behalf of WLA, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Now back to Sarah to kick off our program.
Thank you, Brianna. As you have questions this evening for Clyde W. Ford, please put them into the Q&A section or the chat so that we can help facilitate getting your questions to him when the Q&A begins. Clyde W. Ford is an award-winning author of 13 works of fiction and nonfiction. Think Black is a memoir about his father, the first Black software engineer in America. The book explores the intersection of race, social justice, and high technology. Ford has been a featured guest on The Oprah Show, NPR, and numerous other radio and television programs nationwide. He is currently a speaker in the Humanities Washington Speakers Bureau, so please check out the Humanities Washington website for info on how to bring Clyde to speak in your community. Ford's next book, Of Blood and Sweat, Black Lives and the Making of White Power and Wealth, will be out in April. Ford lives in Bellingham. Clyde Ford, thank you so much for being here with us tonight, and the floor is yours.
Sarah, thank you so much for the honor of being one of the awardees of the 2021 Washington Center for the Book. And Linda, who's now off camera, I want to thank you also. Both of you, I know, worked on my behalf to make sure we submitted a book from the publisher. And although I have no visibility into actually how this book was selected as a finalist in creative nonfiction and a winner, rather, I will say how much I really am appreciative of that. And the reason I'm appreciative of it is I grew up in New York City, but I adopted Washington as my home 30 years ago when I moved here. And so to be given this award really is special to me. It says that the readers and the librarians in Washington State recognize something of value in this book, perhaps also a value in my writing, and that means a great deal to me as an author. I've been fortunate to have a number of awards, some of which you might see on the mantle behind me, but none is more important to me than the Washington Center of the Book Award, because it is the highest honor given to an author here in Washington State. So thank you again very much. Thank you for this opportunity to share at least a short introduction and insight, I hope, into the book and the subject matter of the book. And I also want to thank all of you who've joined us. I'm just amazed that there isn't more COVID and Zoom fatigue. And I'm just really pleased that you could be with us online, although it would be much nicer if I could be with you in person. And I look forward to the opportunity to do that at some future point. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and we'll see where we go from there. And I hope that everybody can see a screen that says Technology, Human Rights, and Social Justice. I am aware that there's a little bit of a lag in my presentation. You might actually see my lips a little further or a little lagging behind what you're actually hearing them say. And that's just an internet connection challenge that I'm not sure there's any way we can get around. So please, let's just put up with that. I thought a great place to start this presentation would be first just to say a few words about the presentation, say what the agenda is. You know, I do want to talk about the history of human rights and social justice, real relationship to high tech, what the implications of that history are, what the current relationship is, and what we can do that will make a difference. And then after that, I hope we'll leave some time for some Q&As if you have any. The presentation should be available online. I know that I was just told it'll be on YouTube and several other places. I'm sure maybe at the end when Sarah comes back in, she'll let you know once again where you can get a second opportunity to view this presentation. I think it's important that you know that the views I express in this presentation are mine, and they're not the belief, views, or policies of the Seattle Public Library or the Washington State Library or the Washington Center for the Book. There's at least one place where some of the imagery that I'll be showing is a little graphic. It is not meant to be graphic, but it might be disturbing to some people. If in any way those images trigger any overwhelming thoughts, feelings, or emotions, please take care of yourself in whatever way you see fit during this presentation, whether that's stepping up and walking away from the screen, whether that's turning off the video and just listening to the audio, whether that's talking to somebody right after the presentation or later about what you observed and what that caused to come up for you. Please take care of yourself in an appropriate way. Now, I thought a really good place to start would be to give you just a little sense of what my first day at IBM was like, and then contrast that with my dad's first day at IBM, because we both worked for the same company, though at very different times. So I'm reading now from the first pages of my book, Think Black. I held fast to an overhead bar as the elevated train I took swayed from side to side, rocketing into Manhattan from the Bronx. When it dove beneath the Harlem River, everything outside the car went dark, and I caught a reflection of myself in the window. A ballooned afro, pork chop sideburns, a blue zoot suit with red pinstripes, a fire engine red turtleneck, and a trench coat with its collar turned up. A half hour later, I strutted from the subway through the light rain hanging over Wall Street, humming the theme to the song of the film Shaft, which I'd seen the night before. I entered one of the skyscrapers, squeezed into the New York financial district, and took an elevator to a higher floor. There, stenciled in blue, the sign on the glass doors read IBM, and beneath them in white, New York Financial Office. On that fall day in 1971, I was young and Black, defiant and angry, and more than ever determined not to be like my father. Yet there I stood, about to report for work at IBM, where he'd worked for 25 years. Okay, that's my first day at IBM. There's my dad in the back towards your right. Picture taken probably, let's see, I think this picture was taken in 1950. It's his IBM colleagues, and he was hired by IBM in 1946, began work in 1947. So very early in his career at IBM. Here's my father's first day. A generation earlier in 1947, my father also gazed across a similar threshold into an IBM office in New York City. My dad was a member of the greatest generation and had been a first lieutenant in the famed 369th Black Infantry Regiment of the United States Army. From the photographs I saw of my father as a young man at 27 years old, he cut a handsome figure in his dark gray suit, red striped tie, and wide brim hat with a satin band. But instead of defiance, he masked diffidence. Instead of anger, he displayed anticipation. Instead of determination not to be like his father, he stood ready to prove to everyone, including his father, that he deserved to be the first Black systems engineer to work at IBM. It was the late 1940s, post-World War II America. Anything was possible. Duke Ellington swung jazz. Jackie Robinson swung a big league bat, and Brown versus Board of Education swung its way through the courts. Nowhere were new possibilities and promises felt more deeply than in Harlem, which was then Black America's gravitational center. In a city college classroom at the edge of Harlem, an accounting professor invited one of her students to dinner. That Black GI arrived at her swanky apartment dressed to the nines. And Thomas J. Watson Sr., founder of IBM, stepped from the shadows. Watson offered my father a job, and a Branch Rickey Jackie Robinson moment ensued, the start of an unknown chapter in the history of modern day computers. Well, I mentioned Branch Rickey and Jackie Robinson. There's a picture of both of them, Branch Rickey, the manager of the Dodgers, Jackie Robinson on the left. And I mentioned it because I really thought, when I started this book, that's the book I was writing. You know, Jackie Robinson was the first Black player in Major League Baseball to step up to a plate and swing in 1947, the same year my dad went to work for IBM. Robinson played for the Brooklyn Dodgers. And I thought, what a great comparison. And kind of this feel-good moment. Jackie Robinson, kind of this feel-good figure in American baseball. My dad, this feel-good moment with Thomas J. Watson Sr. in high tech. Here's a picture, for example. Some of you have actually may have seen the film 42, starring the late Chadwick Boseman. Here's an actual picture of Jackie Robinson swinging for what I think was a home run from Ebbets Field in Brooklyn. My dad was there the first day Jackie Robinson got up to the plate. Again, I thought it was a Branch Rickey Jackie Robinson moment until my editor at HarperCollins asked me, there's a picture of Thomas J. Watson Sr. Tracy said to me one day over lunch when I was in New York City, BC, before COVID, Clyde, you know, I like where you're going. I had about half of the manuscript completed by then. She said, but the problem I have is that I want to know, and I think the readers want to know, who was this guy? Who was this guy Watson that hired your dad in 1946? And why did he do it? I said to Tracy, you know, Tracy, I don't have all the answers to those questions, but I promise you, by the time I submit this manuscript and finish it, I will have those questions answered. Wow, sometimes you really need to be careful what you promise somebody, because in that search for who was Thomas Watson Sr., I discovered an aspect of IBM and their founder that I never, ever expected. And that's what I really want to take you through, because the book then became a lot more than a feel-good story. It really became more of a cautionary tale about high-tech human rights and social justice. So just a little bit of a timeline of digital technology so we can all kind of be on the same page. I'm going to start in 1900 and say that is one of the first digital computing machines. That's actually the actual machine from the census office. In those days, punch card devices, which are early digital machines, were used to count the census. As we move on in the 1930s, you see they look like really beautiful pieces of furniture. That was the first kind of automated accounting device, an IBM 301. That's a really important device as we go on in this story. Just remember what it looked like. Really, to me, looks like a very nice piece of furniture. What you'll notice about that device, you can see a little more clearly in this one, an IBM 407, which was introduced just about the time my dad came to work for IBM. Really important part of that is in the middle is a typewriter converted into a printer. This was some of the first ever automated printers that could take information from cards. And if you look closely, all the way on your left, there's a card reader. It could do some very simple computations and print out results on a typewriter. Much more modern version of computers now. In the 1960s, what I learned, oh my God, that really dates me, is the IBM 360, 370 series. But still, those are behemoths. And by the way, you've got more computing power in your purse than you're looking at in that IBM 360 series there in that room. As I remember, in those days, 8 megabytes of memory was a lot. And now your phone has, what, 256 gigabytes, maybe 1 terabyte of memory. It's an unbelievable difference. Late 1970s, then you've got, you know, computers we recognize more today, like Apple's coming into view. You got the IBM PCs coming into view. The internet came online essentially in 1991, and you had these huge server farms around the world. Quantum computing, I'm not going to go into all that right now. And then finally, you know, you have things like cell phones, which are basically computers that you've got in your hand or in your bag or somewhere close by. But I think it's important just to remember, and as we give this presentation and this look through who is IBM and what is their relationship to high tech and social justice, it's important to remember this timeline. Okay. So what did my discovery unearth? In the early part of the 1900s, the early part of the 20th century, eugenics was the rage throughout the country and throughout the world. Eugenics is that pseudoscience of race that says there is a pure, white, blonde-haired, blue-eyed Nordic stock that is the ideal of humanity, that humanity should strive for, an attempt to remove or excise anybody who doesn't fit that Nordic stock ideal, and that's the word they used. The upper left-hand corner of your screen is Charles Davenport is in the lower part of your screen, and for whatever reason, the fellow in the upper left-hand corner of the screen, name escapes me, but I will remember that name in a minute. Because he was the author of a really famous, unfortunately famous book on race in America called The Passing of the Great Race. This is 1916, and that book, I wish we could look back in history and say, hey, it's just a really famous book that happened long ago. That book was reprinted in 2016 by one of the white supremacist organizations here in the United States. It became actually the basis for Stephen Miller's immigration advice to former President Trump. So this notion that what eugenics was all about is no longer with us, unfortunately, is not true. The ideas of the eugenics folks are very much with us. In fact, so much with us that people, and by the way, I see it now, but I'm glad I at least have it in my screen. That's Madison Grant in the upper left-hand corner. But other people involved with eugenics were people, for example, like Margaret Sanger, very important in women's reproductive health and birth control. And some of the issues that are still actually being adjudicated to this day that were hopefully the Supreme Court won't take away women's rights for choice, but there's certainly that possibility. Margaret Sanger always looked at as an advocate for reproductive rights, yet if you read Margaret's original writing in her words, she believed that what she was doing was supporting the notion of eugenics, and she said that she viewed her work in contraception as, quote, in her words, culling the weeds of humanity. 1926, there was money given to the Eugenics Record Association run by Charles Davenport, lower right-hand image. That money was for a study to be conducted on the island of Jamaica of mixed-race individuals to see if Davenport and the Eugenics Record Association could discriminate who was pure European, who was pure African or pure native to the island of Jamaica, and who was mixed-race individuals, so they could eliminate the pure natives and Africans and mixed-race individuals, separate them out, and use various means, everything from forced sterilization to, I hate to say it, but even death, as means to cull the weeds of humanity. The challenge, however, was that there were so many people on the island of Jamaica, Davenport didn't know how to collect the statistics. He knew what he wanted, but he didn't have enough people writing on yellow pads with pens and pencils to keep the statistics. So in 1928, a young man named Thomas J. Watson Sr., who had just been named the president of a new company that he had then changed the name to IBM, showed up at Davenport's office and said, I have a solution for your problem. We have machines, and you remember that IBM 301, it looked something like that. It was an earlier model than the 301, but we have those kinds of machines that can tabulate results, print reports, and give you the kinds of statistics which will help you with this study. The study was successful. IBM was vindicated as a tool used by the eugenicists. And there was the thought that because this was so successful, this study could be replicated worldwide. The problem was, now we're into the early 30s, and things are starting to stir up in Nazi Germany. However challenging it was, Watson and IBM saw a great opportunity. And what they saw then was that what went on in the Jamaica study was really what Hitler was asking to do in Germany, to be able to separate out a portion of the population for differential treatment, and therefore to be able to discriminate and to do whatever he chose to with those individuals. And so I was really amazed, jaw-droppingly amazed, that IBM was so deeply involved in every aspect of the Holocaust and the Third Reich. Look, I could do 2 or 3 hours just on IBM's involvement with Hitler and the Third Reich, but let me just read a short selection from the book to give you a sense of what I'm talking about. IBM machines identified and counted Jews, traced back their ancestry for generations, marked them for transport to concentration camps, managed the railroads that transported them there, kept track of which Jews were killed and which remained alive, identified which Jews possessed what skills and helped Nazis allocate them for slave labor, monitored the health and fitness of Jews for barbaric medical experiments or being worked to death, kept records of the torture and execution of Jews in all concentration camps, kept track of German soldiers, planned German tank and troop movements against the Allies, and even scheduled Luftwaffe bombing runs. Wow. When I was reading through the original well-documented research on this involvement of IBM with the Third Reich and the Holocaust, I have to tell you, I woke up alternating wanting to vomit and crying. It was so incredible that the early uses of technology were so deeply wedded to studies in the ways and the barbaric manner in which humans can treat other humans. You know, again, just to say a tiny bit more about IBM's involvement in the Holocaust, Holocaust scholars have often wondered why an SS officer could arrive in a open-top car standing in the back of a square of a small town, get up, look down at a list and say, I want this person, I want this person, I want that person at this address to report in front of me. And all the people that that officer wanted were Jews. The reason he knew is because the sheet he had in front of him was printed by IBM printers based on the data collected by IBM machines and IBM punch cards. The story is dramatic, it is horrendous, and it's also true. And it was part of my investigation. Now, after Jamaica and after Berlin and Hitler, I kind of got the idea of what was going on with early IBM. And so I wondered, oh my God, I wonder what they did after the war. When the Allies won and the Axis powers were defeated, did IBM just shelve that technology, which would have been great? That's not the way technology works, though. I know that because I've been in high tech for years, that technology works based on, if it works in this way here, I'm going to find another area that it equally works in as well. So if I'm Thomas J. Watson and it's late 40s, middle to late 40s, and I'm looking around the world, where else am I going to find a place that maybe this kind of technology can work? Oh, the answer is pretty simple. Only need to look to Pretoria in South Africa. And I then realized, oh my God, I bet my first thought was, I wonder if IBM was involved. And what I discovered is not was IBM just involved. IBM was the technological engine behind apartheid. And I'll just give you just a sample of what I mean by that. In apartheid, there are two kinds of passbooks, essentially, that you need to have in your possession based on whether you were white or colored, which is a South African word for mixed race, or black. And was called the Book of Life. That was a book that white South Africans and colored South Africans carried. And then there was the National Pass, or the National Passbook, that black South Africans were supposed to carry. It was also known as the Dam Pass, the South African word for dumb. And if you were caught outside of a Bantustan, pretty much like a Native American reservation that black South Africans were assigned to, if you were caught outside of that without your national identification pass, or the Dam Pass, you could be subject to summary arrest or even killed. Now, there had to be data collected as to who was given those passes. That data was collected by IBM machines. Those passbooks had to be printed. IBM constructed special machinery to print the passbooks used by the apartheid regime. Up until the 1980s, and we're talking now not just about that furniture looking like computers, but we're talking about sophisticated, more modern day computers and databases and disk drives and tape readers. IBM was the engine technologically that maintained the existence of the apartheid system. Again, it was a wow moment for me to realize the involvement of high tech in this real abrogation of human rights. But it didn't stop there. And you have to think by now, you know, Jamaica study, Berlin and Hitler and Germany and apartheid. Okay, what do you do next? Well, here's what IBM did next. 2005, right after the 9/11 bombings, New York City instituted something called the LMSI, Lower Manhattan Security Initiative, which basically, huge room, you've probably seen something like this on some spy television show program, huge room, darkened, lots of big screen monitors all around it. You know, the three-letter names of different agencies with little tent cards on all the desks, FBI, CIA, DEA, DIA, ATF, you name it. It has a seat at the room. And this room takes the feeds, one of the things it does, of thousands of CCTV cameras around New York City. Now, I've been in rooms like this. I know what they're like. They do exist. It's not just television fiction. There are rooms like this. The problem is, everybody who's part of this internal security structure knows this. No one person can look at those screens and see what's going on. There's too much happening. You can't monitor it, but computers can. IBM knew this. IBM was involved in the creation of the LMSI, and IBM, without the approval, consent, or knowledge of New Yorkers in 2005, began a study to see if their analysis, computer-based analysis of the footage from CCTV cameras could discriminate against people based on skin color. Wow. There is no difference between doing that with sophisticated modern computers and doing that with punch cards where you're trying to discriminate against who's mixed race, who's pure European, and who's pure African or native in Jamaica, even though you're talking about something now that's like 80 years before that this happened. That is the same goal of technology, to be able to use technology in order to make it easy to determine who is subject to a differential treatment based on the color of their skin. Now, that's called facial recognition technology. It is still in play in lots of places. I will say this, in the spring of 2020, IBM hired a new CEO, Arvind Krishna, who I've actually had the opportunity to talk to directly. Microsoft CEO Satya Nadella I have also sat down with him. Amazon also, I've sat down with some of the folks at Amazon. I was so pleased when IBM issued a statement in spring of 2020, pulling back from development, research, and sales and facial recognition technology, and the other companies followed. The problem, however, is that left this gap in the field that lots of smaller companies said, okay, the big boys aren't playing. That just gives us more opportunity to continue with this. Some cities like Cambridge, Portland, and I believe I heard something about this in Seattle, have banned the use of facial recognition technology by their police forces because it is so not only discriminative, but it doesn't work that well. And again, I don't have time to go into the full explanation of that, but a study in 2019, September, showed that facial recognition technology is particularly poor at recognizing the faces of women, people of color, and of children. And if you subtract out who then it is, and the elderly, it is capable of recognizing, you'll see that it works best for white men between the ages of 25 and 40, which, not surprisingly, is the group that most likely developed this technology. So IBM called this, cynically, I feel, Watson facial recognition technology. Well, social media is based not just on facial recognition technology, but based on all of the technology that we've talked about up to this point. That's what there would be no Facebook, no Twitter, no Pinterest, no WhatsApp without the technological backbone of the internet and the technology that's available to us. My dad, for example, was involved in creating some of the early technology that then went in to become the internet. And I just tell you a really brief story of what happened when I was taking a plane shortly before my book was actually released. And I was sitting next to another famous author, and we were talking, and turns out that her father also worked for IBM same time as my dad. And we said, oh, probably knew each other. She said to me, when she heard what I was writing about, she said, you know, I want to tell you a story about my dad. Shortly before he died, she lived in New York City. And she said, my dad and I were walking down the street and everybody had their face down looking at their cell phones. And my dad turned to me and said, because my dad didn't have a cell phone, this is the woman talking to me. And she said, my dad asked me, what are they doing? And so I explained to him, you know, what they were doing, and that obviously he made the connection that a lot of what the work was that he had done had gone into that. And she said, he looked at me, he put his hands in his head in his hands and shook his head and said, oh my God, we released a monster. And I think that's true that many of the men and women of that generation, of my dad's generation, the first generation in high tech, thought they were creating an egalitarian structure that would make it easier for people to vote, make it easier for people to share accurate information, make it easier for people to connect with each other. What, however, was used by this technology, or how this technology was used, was just the opposite. So, for example, the technology is used to incite, to organize, and to even execute plans that go against the very democratic ideas that the people who created this technology even had. You know, I don't have to tell you that in the January 6th insurrection, most of the guys there were white men. Some Capitol Police were involved, and so were soldiers, including some members of the Seattle Police Force. It was an extremely racist and white supremacist gathering. Christian symbols were used. There were no tanks or military equipment arrayed against those protesters. No rubber bullets were fired into their ranks. There were no megaphone warnings. There were no unarmed, unnamed federal officers amongst them. Again, I'm making the contrast to what we saw in other cities at the same time. There was no real equivalence to what went on January 6th and what went on, let's say, at the Black Lives Matter protest. Now, I'm just going to flash through some of these, but how about this fellow on your left? Look what he's holding in his hand. Cell phone. How about this fellow sitting in Nancy Pelosi's office? Look what he's got in his hand. Cell phone, latest iteration of high-tech digital technology. The challenge is that there's bias in science and technology. There's bias in the way it's not only used, and that's what we showed you, just a moment ago, but there's even bias in the ways that it's produced. Here's a great example of what I mean by that. Let's take the study of pulse oximeters. Pulse oximeters are those little devices you basically wrap on your fingertips, and they tell you whether your blood is oxygenated enough. Extremely important in fighting COVID, because they basically tell you who might need a respirator and who might not. I don't think a lot of people realize that there was a problem, that the first pulse oximeters that were used in the beginning of the pandemic did not correctly read African Americans and other people with dark skin. They gave false positives of those readings, meaning they were often too high, and suggested that those individuals didn't need respirators. So the very people who in the beginning of the pandemic were most subjected to some of the challenges of COVID, the technology behind that made it more difficult to even diagnose that they were faced with those challenges. The solution, obviously, is to train engineers who design these products in history of racism and bias. And when those products are designed and built, you don't just test them like facial recognition technology on one isolated group of people. If you want them to be used, you have to test them on a wide cross range of individuals. Some of you may remember something similar happened with soap dispensers and water faucets in airport lavatories. And there was, and still are, pictures on the internet of people of color who are unable to have the soap dispensed or the water turn on because those devices don't read dark skins well. And that's a clear example of bias in high tech. But I couldn't believe that in 2015, a Norwegian company, I believe it was Norwegian, Scandinavian company, put out a game called Slave Tetris. This is a screenshot of the game, believing that it was going to be an educational game on slavery. Wow. The idea was you walk a slave up a ship's ladder and drop that slave into a ship's hold, and you move the slave right or left. That slave takes on a shape in order to stack the ship's hold as tightly as it can. The idea, again, was that somehow this was going to teach children about the horrors of slavery. I can tell you that it did not achieve that, and that as an educational game, it really treated slavery in this very dismissive way, dismissing or minimizing the historical importance or impact of slave trade on African Americans and people of African descent. Again, the problem is you need to train developers in high-tech fields on the history of racism. And you also need to have a really diverse group of people looking at these products before they're released. Look, if I was in the focus group that saw this game, believe me, I would have been screaming, and I'm sure a lot of other African Americans were, as we did when it finally came out. And fortunately, it was removed from the market. I think you also need a more diverse corporate decision-making group. I can't imagine a company that actually has a person of color in their C-suite releasing a product like this and feeling it did some good. Just another really quick example of this. In 2016, we're not talking about that far long ago, Microsoft released a Twitter bot that is a piece of software acting like a person that goes around the Twitterverse interacting with other users. Within 24 hours of the release of Tay, the name of that Twitter bot, Tay became extensively, increasingly racist, anti-Semitic, and sexist. If you ask Tay about the Holocaust, Tay would say the Holocaust never happened. If you ask Tay about women, Tay would say, I hate all women. And if you ask Tay about DeRay McKesson, who was one of the leading members of Black Lives Matter, Tay would actually say, DeRay McKesson ought to be hung. So fortunately, technology, Microsoft pulled it off the Twitterverse. I actually think, and I even said to Satya Nadella, I think there was no way to handle that. I wish Microsoft had handled it slightly differently. And that is actually building into Tay some checks for the kind of racism that it might encounter. That would, of course, meant the developers would have understand a little bit more about the history of racism. They were developers from China who really had no clue about the history of racism in America. Wouldn't it have been great if a Twitter bot like Tay, when faced with a question about the Holocaust and somebody saying it didn't exist, Tay turned around and said, are you crazy? Here's the information about the Holocaust. Check out these links. Or even today, when somebody claims that, COVID-19 is not real, we don't have to worry about it, nobody needs to be vaccinated, there was a check out there. Maybe a Twitter bot that said, are you crazy? Here are the death rates, here are the hospital rates, here's the information. So I wish that there was another way to use this technology actually to counter ignorance and misinformation. So we're really getting towards the end here. I want to leave just a little time for questions, but I'm just going to say a couple of things about what I think high-tech firms can do. I think they can hire more minorities and women of color. I think you can train their employees on a range of ways and members of marginalized communities up the ranks to decision-making positions. And here's something I think we can do, and our librarians are at the head of doing this. We all need to become more digitally literate, and librarians are there to help us do just that. What do I mean by digitally literate? Do you realize that most people, and maybe you do as well, believe that the higher on a search page a result is, the more truth there is to it? I was amazed that 75% of people surveyed believe that to be the case. The fact of the matter is you can purchase a location on a search page, and therefore where it's positioned has nothing to do with whether it's true or not. Librarians know this. Librarians can help you, can help us, can help our children become more digitally literate by learning how to use the internet in a more appropriate way. We can learn to get news from our reputable sources as opposed to one-side purveyors of misinformation. We can look at our use of social media platforms and our unquestioned allegiance to Facebook and Twitter. Maybe we want to pull back from that use. Maybe we want to have a higher age, like 18, as an age of consent for using this technology. So much more we could say about this. Again, I wish I had time to do that. Maybe there'll be another opportunity for us to talk about that. I think the other thing we can do is we can look at various ways in which we can become more anonymous on the internet so that we're not followed from site to site by Google and by Microsoft and other companies who are basically trying to use our information for their gain. You know what we say in high tech is this: if it's free, then your information is what's being used to make a profit. In other words, you're giving up your information freely to Google and Facebook and Twitter, and they're using that information, mining that information, and selling that information to make billions and billions of dollars. And I think we need to better understand that so we can ask the question, is that right? Well, you know, as a discussion questions, and this is also a presentation I've given to college classes, but I think it's certainly accurate for all of us to ponder questions like how many results down a search page do we look? What online sources do we get our news? How many hours a day do we spend on social media? Should social media companies be more greatly regulated? And how much do I know about the alternative browsers, search engines, and email platforms that can protect my identity online? Your library has a lot of books that can help you better understand this area. My book is one of them, and I'm certainly appreciative of those of you who are interested in this book. And again, very appreciative of Washington Center of the Book for nominating me and granting me this award in creative nonfiction. But these are some of the other books by my colleagues who have also looked at the challenges that we face as a society and how we rein in high tech so that we're not working for high tech, but high tech is working for us. Thank you so much for this opportunity to share some thoughts and ideas with you. If you do have any questions, I'm going to go back out of sharing mode into live presentation mode. And Sarah, I know, will read those questions to me, hopefully scan through them, and let's see how far we can get to answer them.
Thank you so much, Clyde. Thank you for that presentation and for your work, for the book. It's a lot to take in. I want to remind folks they can drop any questions for you in the chat or the Q&A, and we will get them to you. And I just wanted to start with a question about your research process. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about it, like what libraries and resources did you use? Were you using mostly primary sources for your research of IBM, or academic journals, books? Obviously, I would assume some interviews. What was your process like? I'm sure it was immense.
Yeah, that's great. It's a great question. Again, I wish I had more time to talk about that because I'd love to do that. But yes, I always, when I write and I'm doing nonfiction, I always try to be as close to primary sources as I can. And there are a lot of great primary sources on IBM. I will say that for the section on IBM and the Holocaust, I used the work of a gentleman who's become a friend of mine. The book is called IBM and the Holocaust. And he wrote a book in which this is Edwin Black, wrote a book in which he used 35 file cabinets full of primary research, much of which is documents written in French and German about IBM and Dutch, and about IBM's involvement in the Holocaust. And I thought, well, you know, I'm never going to replicate the extensive work that Edwin did. So let me not worry about that and just use him as a secondary source, knowing that anybody who's interested can get him as a primary source. However, when we went to South Africa, no one had written a book on that. And so I was faced with the question, how do you get that information? And I ended up finding in a very surprising way that the best source of information on IBM's involvement in the Holocaust were public records from the trials of individuals and groups in South Africa who sued the IBM and other companies in America based on a 1700 law called the Foreign Tort Act. And part of the court documents then had extensive documentation on IBM's involvement in apartheid, much of which IBM never contested in court. And so that was a great source of information for me in terms of primary material. Of course, it also is a book about my dad, and there I didn't have to worry too much about primary sources because I lived that experience. And so it was a range of different ways that I went about researching this book. I will say the one thing I tried to do, and maybe I succeeded, was to put it together in such a way that it didn't just read like a dry retelling of history, but it was more an engaged narrative of my own exploration and my relationship with my father.
Thank you. We've also got a few comments that have come in, and so I just want to share that with you. Gotten congratulations on your award. Somebody wrote when you were talking about the sort of more recent software, that it was sickening and that developers need to be held accountable. More recent comment that just came in: this was amazing. I read your book and your writing is wonderful. I learned a lot and look forward to your next book. And I encourage you to teach an even longer class. So thank you. And I guess as a related follow-up question to that, can you tell us a little bit about that book that's coming out in April? I know before we began, I asked you when you finished it, and that story is kind of incredible to share, but also if you could just maybe tell folks a little bit about it.
I can, and I'd love to do that, in part because the book, right from the cover, has a Seattle nexus to it. And if you can see this, you'll see on the cover Above Blood and Sweat, Black Lives, and it really is the creation of white power and wealth. Now, that title's been slightly changed. This is what in the industry we call an ARC, advanced reading copy. But again, I'll just hold it up. Some of you may recognize that painting. That's a famous painting from Jacob Lawrence's Migration series. Jacob Lawrence was the African-American painter who lived in Seattle, and I had an opportunity to speak at the center where he and his wife spent their final years. So just a wonderful Seattle connection. A Blood and Sweat is really the story about how from pre-colonial times to the present day, the institutions of power and wealth that we recognize, whether they're in the legal field, whether they're in law enforcement, whether they're in religion, whether they're in medicine, whether they're in transportation or agriculture, those important institutions of our society were either created by people of African descent or created to control people of African descent. And this book traces that story, not just again as a dry kind of academic historical record, but I take the lives of individuals and follow the lives of some of the individuals who we can recognize, like a man and a woman on the first ship of Africans that landed in America. Wasn't even America at that time, it was a British colony of Virginia in 1619. And I follow their story as far as we can. And so I take the lives of individuals and use them as focal points to look at the relationship of people of color, particularly people of African descent, to the creation of white power and wealth here in this country, and how, unfortunately, they never shared in the wealth and the institutions of power and wealth that they created. So that was the idea for the book. It comes now at a time when critical race theory is under this crazy discussion around the country where people are banned from even talking about historical truths. Many people don't know there's also a Seattle nexus for critical race theory. The right-wing individual who created the idea of using critical race theory as a cultural wedge was a Seattle native. His name escapes me. Critical race theory is really a legal theory. It's not necessarily a historical theory. Although the book isn't about critical race theory, certainly it will be categorized as a book about critical race theory. And quite frankly, that's a discussion I look forward to having with anybody who thinks there's something wrong with telling the truth about history. Like, for example, the truth that Thomas Jefferson not only had slaves, but used the slaves he had as collateral for his debts, and in doing so, created the idea of collateralized package mortgages that we still use in the financial system today. those are, I think, important stories for us to know about because they impact us even to this very day. So that's what the book is about, and I look forward to being able to talk more about this with you the next time maybe we're together on a hosted event by Washington State Library and Seattle Public Library.
Thank you so much. I think we've got time for one more question before we are out of time. And this one came in from an audience member. Did IBM ever acknowledge any accountability for how their involvement in those world events are viewed today?
No, that's really clear. IBM had never acknowledged it other than sending out a mass email to their company employees shortly before Ed Black's book came out saying, you're going to hear some things about IBM that might be upsetting. IBM always claimed that I've spoken directly to the new CEO and I said, you know, you guys really should do something that makes a difference. You ought to acknowledge what happened historically. It's not who you are now, but unless you acknowledge it, you can't get beyond it and people can't get beyond it. Truth and reconciliation starts with truth telling. Well, that never happened. In part, it's never going to happen probably because IBM is afraid of the suits that would occur, the legal suits that would occur by their acknowledging of their involvement in the Holocaust and apartheid. I cite in the book the judge in New York City, Sarah Schindlin, who issued a ruling in the case of the South African group that sued IBM, in which she said, it was just amazing that a judge would say this. She said, I am so sorry that I can't issue another ruling because of the damage IBM did to the plaintiffs. But the laws of this state and of this country tie my hands. So she was admitting that the proof was so persuasive, and it was, but she couldn't do anything. So no, IBM has never acknowledged it. I'm not sure they ever will acknowledge it. I think they should acknowledge it. There have been attempted suits by Jewish organizations, by South Africans against IBM. Those suits have never been successful, in part because IBM as a huge corporation has deep, deep, deep financial pockets, which will certainly be formidable in any court battle with individuals. We have time for one more, or are we out of time, Sarah?
I think we are out of time. We're right at 7, and we got through most of the audience questions, but I just want to thank you again and congratulate you on this well-deserved award. Thank you so much for your work, for sharing it with us, and for being with us here tonight. Much, much appreciated.
Thank you, Sarah. I look forward to coming back and sharing more with you sometime soon. Bye now. And thanks to everybody who joined us tonight as well, too.